Mafia Boss dining with his fiancée, until the Black Maid whispered, "Run." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character, Victor Romano. Victor Romano sat at the center of the dining room as if the space had been designed around him long before he arrived. A quiet gravity pulling every detail into order, the polished oak table, the low amber lighting, the measured rhythm of service that moved with careful precision. At 38, Victor carried himself with the ease of a man accustomed to being obeyed, not because he demanded attention, but because attention naturally followed him. His tailored jacket rested comfortably on his shoulders, his watch caught the light at just the right angle, and his posture never shifted, even as conversation flowed around him. Across the table sat his fiancée, Isabella, elegant and composed, her smile practiced but warm, her hands folded neatly as she spoke about the upcoming weekend as though nothing in the world could possibly interrupt their plans. To anyone watching from a distance, this was a flawless scene. A powerful man enjoying a quiet evening with the woman he intended to marry, shielded by reputation, wealth, and the unspoken understanding that nothing truly touched Victor Romano unless he allowed it. The restaurant itself reflected that same sense of control, muted jazz playing softly, glassware aligned perfectly, every chair placed with intention, a space where people came to feel important without having to say it out loud. Staff moved silently, trained to anticipate needs before requests were made, to exist at the edges of the experience without ever intruding upon it. Among them was Naomi Brooks, dressed in a simple uniform that blended into the background by design, her movements careful, her expression neutral, her presence barely registered by the guests she passed. She had learned long ago that invisibility was not just expected but required, that the safest place for someone like her was just outside the frame of attention. As Victor listened to Isabella speak, his gaze occasionally drifted across the room, not searching, simply observing, a habit formed over years of reading spaces the way others read headlines. He noticed the flow of service, the timing of each plate, the way conversations rose and fell, all of it aligning into what felt like a perfectly controlled evening. Naomi crossed behind him with a practiced step, eyes lowered, senses alert, aware of details others dismissed as background noise. She noticed the subtle shifts in tone, the pauses that lasted a fraction longer than they should have, the feeling that something in the room did not quite match the calm surface everyone accepted. Victor, meanwhile, remained relaxed, confident in the structure surrounding him, confident in the assumptions that came with his name and his position. He had built a life where order followed him wherever he went, where unpredictability was something that happened to other people. Isabella laughed softly at something he said, and for a moment, the room seemed to breathe in unison, comfortable in the illusion of safety. Naomi slowed her pace, her attention sharpening, her instincts quietly insisting that this moment, this very ordinary moment, mattered more than anyone realized. She did not speak, did not signal, did not draw attention to herself in any way. She simply moved closer, carrying with her the weight of a choice she had not yet made, while Victor Romano sat unaware that the calm he trusted so deeply was already beginning to shift. Naomi Brooks had learned to read rooms long before she learned to trust them, and as she moved through the dining room with a tray balanced easily in her hands, her attention stayed fixed on the spaces between things rather than the things themselves. She noticed how conversations overlapped without colliding, how laughter rose and fell in controlled intervals, how the staff adjusted their steps instinctively around Victor Romano's table as if an invisible boundary surrounded him. To most people, Victor represented certainty, the kind of man whose presence reassured others that nothing unexpected would happen under his watch. To Naomi, certainty was often the first thing to fracture when something was about to go wrong. She passed behind him again, close enough to hear the low cadence of his voice, calm and measured, the sound of someone who had never needed to rush his words. Isabella leaned toward him. As she spoke, her posture relaxed, her confidence grounded in the assumption that the evening belonged to them. Naomi lowered her eyes as she set down a glass at a nearby table, her reflection briefly visible in its polished surface, steady on the outside, alert beneath the calm. She had worked in places like this before, spaces built on quiet rules and unspoken hierarchies, where some people were meant to be seen and others were meant to disappear. Being unseen had kept her employed, had paid her bills, had allowed her to move through long shifts without becoming a problem for anyone. But invisibility also gave her access to details no one bothered to hide from her, glances that lingered a second too long, movements that felt rehearsed rather than natural, small deviations that disrupted the rhythm she had come to recognize. As she approached the service station, she paused, her attention drawn back to Victor's table by a subtle change in energy that had nothing to do with sound. Victor had shifted his posture slightly, not enough to alarm anyone else, but enough for Naomi to notice. His gaze swept the room again, slow and deliberate, then settled back on Isabella, as if dismissing whatever had caught his attention. Naomi felt a quiet tension settle in her chest, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that came from years of relying on instinct when logic had no proof to offer. She reminded herself that it was not her place to interpret the mood of powerful people, that her role was to serve, to move on, to remain unnoticed. Still, she found herself lingering a moment longer than necessary, pretending to adjust the placement of silverware while listening, watching, absorbing. Isabella's laughter sounded lighter now, but Naomi sensed a tightness beneath it, a polished ease that required effort to maintain. Victor smiled, courteous, controlled, but his eyes no longer rested easily on his surroundings. The room continued as it always had, plates being cleared, glasses refilled, music playing softly in the background, 100 ordinary details reinforcing the illusion that nothing here could possibly unravel. Naomi straightened, her decision not yet formed but already pressing against her thoughts. She had learned that moments like this did not announce themselves loudly, that danger rarely arrived with drama, preferring instead to slip quietly into familiar spaces. As she turned to move away, she glanced once more toward Victor Romano, aware that whatever she was sensing would either fade into nothing or demand something from her that invisibility could no longer provide. She resumed her measured pace, carrying with her the weight of that uncertainty, knowing that the evening was no longer as simple as it appeared, even if no one else at the table had realized it yet. Naomi Brooks slowed her steps as she approached the service corridor near Victor Romano's table, not because she needed to, but because her instincts were no longer willing to be rushed. The sense of imbalance she felt had sharpened, narrowing her focus to details most people would never register. She noticed how one of the men seated 2 tables away glanced toward Victor and then away too quickly, his smile returning a beat later than it should have. She noticed how Isabella's hand tightened briefly around her glass before relaxing again, the motion subtle, practiced, almost graceful in its restraint. Naomi reminded herself that assumptions were dangerous, that noticing patterns did not always mean understanding them, but her body reacted anyway, tension settling between her shoulders as if preparing her for something she could not yet name. Victor spoke again, his voice calm, reassuring, the sound carrying easily through the space without needing to rise. He was used to being listened to, used to rooms adjusting themselves around him, and Naomi recognized that confidence as something earned over time, reinforced by countless evenings that ended exactly as planned. Yet even Victor, for all his awareness, did not seem to sense what unsettled her now. Naomi adjusted a place, sitting at a nearby table, her hands steady despite the quiet urgency pressing at her thoughts. She remembered her grandmother telling her that trouble rarely announced itself, that it slipped into familiar places wearing polite expressions, trusting that no one would challenge it. The dining room still looked perfect, but the rhythm had shifted again, just slightly, like music that had drifted off tempo. Naomi caught her own reflection in a darkened window and barely recognized the woman looking back, someone older than her years, shaped by long hours of watching rather than being seen. She had learned to survive by keeping her head down, by understanding that speaking out often cost more than it gained, especially for someone whose presence was considered replaceable. But as She watched Victor lean back in his chair, relaxed. Unaware of the tension she felt coiling in the air, she realized that remaining silent carried its own weight. Isabella smiled again, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the entrance before returning to Victor, a movement so small it could easily be dismissed as coincidence. Naomi felt a quiet confirmation settle inside her, not proof, not certainty, but enough to make ignoring it impossible. She stepped away from the table, her mind racing through possibilities, calculating consequences she had never intended to face tonight. She could finish her shift, go home, tell herself she had imagined the whole thing, that it was not her responsibility to interpret the moods of people far above her station. That would be the safest choice, the one she had made countless times before. Yet safety felt different now, heavier, as though it demanded something from her in return. Victor's laughter sounded again, warm, controlled, the kind of sound that reassured others he was exactly where he belonged. Naomi paused near the edge of the dining room, her pulse steady but her resolve beginning to form, aware that the distance between noticing and acting was shrinking. She understood that once she crossed that line, invisibility would no longer protect her, that whatever happened next would change the way this night ended, regardless of whether anyone else was ready for it. She took a breath, grounding herself in the simple fact of the moment, the weight of the tray in her hands, the low hum of conversation around her, knowing that soon she would have to decide whether to remain part of the background or step briefly into a space she had spent her life avoiding. Naomi Brooks felt the decision pressing closer as she returned to the edge of Victor Romano's table, her presence acknowledged only by a brief glance from another staff member who subtly motioned for her to keep moving. It was not spoken aloud, but the message was clear. She was lingering too long, drawing attention where none was wanted. Naomi adjusted her posture and nodded slightly, accepting the reminder with the quiet professionalism expected of her. This was how the room functioned. Invisible boundaries enforced not through words but through looks, pauses, and the subtle redirection of people deemed unnecessary to the main event. She stepped aside, allowing another server to pass. Her awareness sharpened by the way the dining room continued to flow as if nothing had changed. Victor and Isabella were now discussing dessert, their tones light, their body language relaxed, a picture of comfort that seemed almost deliberate in its perfection. Naomi watched Isabella tilt her head as she spoke, the movement graceful but measured, as though every gesture had been practiced in advance. A manager crossed Naomi's path and quietly reminded her to attend to another section, his voice polite but firm, reinforcing the unspoken rule that proximity to Victor Romano was not her place. Naomi complied without hesitation, moving away as instructed, her face calm, her expression neutral, but the sense of urgency within her did not fade. Being redirected only confirmed what she already knew, that she was expected to remain a background detail, present only when summoned, dismissed the moment she appeared unnecessary. She carried a tray to a nearby table, her movements precise, her mind still anchored to Victor's presence across the room. From this distance, she could see how easily others deferred to him, how conversations adjusted when he spoke, how even the staff seemed to operate on a different rhythm around him. Naomi understood the appeal of that kind of authority, the comfort it offered to those who believed it meant safety. She also understood how dangerous that belief could be. As she set down a plate, she noticed the same man from earlier shift in his seat again, his attention flicking toward the entrance once more before settling back into casual conversation. No one else reacted. No one else seemed to notice. Naomi felt the familiar frustration of being the only one alert in a room full of confident people. She returned to the service area, her hands steady despite the quiet pressure building in her chest. A colleague passed her and murmured that everything was running smoothly tonight, a comment meant to reassure rather than inform. Naomi offered a small smile in response, knowing that smoothness was often the last thing people noticed before something changed. She glanced back toward Victor Romano one more time, aware that he had not looked in her direction once, that to him she remained exactly what the system intended her to be, a functional presence without a voice. That realization stung more than she expected, not because she needed recognition, but because it underscored how easily her concerns could be dismissed without ever being heard. The room continued its quiet performance, music playing softly, glasses clinking, laughter drifting through the air, all of it reinforcing the illusion that the evening was under control. Naomi stood at the edge of that illusion, her role clear, her options narrowing, knowing that the longer she remained silent, the more complicit she would become in whatever unfolded next. Naomi Brooks stood near the service station, her hands resting lightly against the cool surface as she focused on slowing her breathing, aware that the calm she presented to the room was beginning to cost her more effort than usual. The decision she had been avoiding pressed against her thoughts with increasing weight, forcing memories she usually kept sealed away to surface one by one. She remembered her first job in a place like this, how quickly she learned that silence was not just expected but rewarded, that speaking up rarely changed outcomes and often made life harder. She remembered being told to keep her head down, to be grateful for work, to understand her place. Those lessons had kept her employed, had kept her safe, but they had also trained her to doubt her own instincts whenever they conflicted with the comfort of others. As she glanced back toward Victor Romano, she felt that doubt rise again, whispering that she was imagining things, that people like him did not need warnings from people like her. Victor appeared completely at ease, listening to Isabella with polite attention, his confidence unshaken, his posture relaxed. He embodied control in a way Naomi had seen many guests admire, mistaking authority for protection. Naomi wondered if that confidence was precisely what made him vulnerable in moments like this, when the room seemed so orderly that no one felt the need to question it. She considered the consequences of intervening, how easily her actions could be misunderstood, how quickly her job could disappear if she disrupted an evening meant to be flawless. She had responsibilities waiting for her after this shift, bills that did not pause for moments of conscience, a life built on careful calculations that did not leave room for impulsive heroics. Yet the awareness she carried would not fade, no matter how hard she tried to dismiss it. Doing the right thing rarely felt comfortable in the moment, that it often arrived disguised as fear rather than certainty. Naomi felt that fear now, steady and insistent, reminding her that ignoring what she sensed would not absolve her of responsibility if something went wrong. She watched Isabella lift her glass again, the smile returning easily to her face, and noticed how her eyes briefly scanned the room once more before settling. Naomi did not know what that meant, only that it reinforced her unease. She felt herself standing at the edge of a line she had never crossed before, one separating survival from choice. For years, she had accepted that her role was to observe without acting, to move through spaces without altering them. Tonight challenged that belief in a way she could not ignore. She told herself that she did not need proof to trust her instincts, that sometimes awareness itself was enough to justify action. The thought terrified her, not because she feared being wrong, but because she feared being right. As Victor laughed softly at something Isabella said, Naomi realized that if she remained silent, she would be choosing comfort over conviction, safety over responsibility. She straightened her shoulders, feeling the quiet resolve settle in her chest, understanding that whatever happened next would follow her long after the dining room lights dimmed. She did not yet know how she would act, only that the choice was no longer abstract. It was immediate, personal, and unavoidable. Naomi Brooks felt the moment narrowing around her as the dining room continued its quiet routine, the distance between thought and action shrinking with every passing second. She moved closer to Victor Romano's table under the simple pretense of clearing an empty glass, her steps measured, her expression unchanged, yet her awareness sharpened to a precise edge. This was the space she had avoided her entire working life, the moment when invisibility no longer served its purpose. She could feel the weight of the room pressing in on her, the unspoken expectation that she would do her job and nothing more, that she would pass through and leave no trace. Victor's attention remained on Isabella, his body language relaxed, his confidence intact, as though the evening itself had promised him nothing would disturb it. Naomi noticed how easily that confidence filled the space, how it discouraged questions before they could even form. She reminded herself that people like Victor survived by trusting their control, by believing that order would always announce disruption before it arrived. She also knew that belief was often misplaced. As she reached the edge of the table, she hesitated, her hand hovering briefly over the back of a chair as if grounding herself in the physical reality of the moment. Her mind raced through the consequences one last time. The certainty of being dismissed, the possibility of being wrong, the likelihood that her intervention would not be welcomed or understood. She considered stepping away, telling herself that she had done her part by noticing that responsibility belonged to those with authority, not to someone trained to remain unseen. Yet the feeling in her chest refused to ease, insisting that walking away would follow her far longer than any immediate fallout. She thought of the many nights she had gone home, replaying moments she wished she had handled differently, words she had swallowed, instincts she had ignored. This felt like one of those moments, except the cost of silence seemed heavier than usual. Victor shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze drifting across the room again before returning to Isabella, the movement subtle but deliberate. Naomi read it not as suspicion, but as habit, the kind of awareness that came from experience rather than concern. She realized then that whatever she sensed would not be acted upon unless she made it impossible to ignore. Her pulse remained steady as she leaned closer, aware that the line she was about to cross could not be uncrossed. She did not plan a speech or search for the right explanation, understanding that words would only complicate what needed to be simple. This was not about proving anything, not about being believed, but about interrupting a moment that felt dangerously settled. She adjusted her posture, ensuring her voice would carry only to Victor and no one else, choosing discretion over drama, restraint over confrontation. In that instant, Naomi accepted that she might lose more than she gained, that she might be remembered as a disruption rather than a warning. She accepted it anyway. The choice, once made, felt strangely calm, as though the tension she had been carrying finally knew where to go. Naomi leaned in just enough to be heard, her presence no longer invisible, her resolve steady, prepared to say the single word that could change the course of the evening. Naomi Brooks leaned in close enough that her shadow briefly crossed the edge of Victor Romano's place setting, a movement so small it blended naturally into the rhythm of service, unnoticed by anyone who was not meant to notice it. Her voice, when it came, was low and controlled, shaped by years of learning when silence mattered and when it did not. She did not preface it with apology or explanation, did not soften it with context or justification, because instinct told her that anything more would dilute what needed to be said. The single word left her lips quietly, almost gently, as though it belonged there, as though it had always been waiting for the right moment to exist. Run. The word carried no panic, no urgency that would draw eyes or disrupt the room, yet it landed with precision, cutting through the comfort Victor had trusted moments before. For the first time that evening, Victor did not respond immediately. His body did not tense, his expression did not change, but something inside him shifted, subtle and unmistakable. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when a moment demanded attention without explanation, when hesitation mattered more than certainty. He did not ask Naomi to repeat herself. He did not turn to look at her. He simply held still, absorbing the weight of a warning delivered without motive or request. Isabella continued speaking for half a second longer before noticing the change, her voice tapering off as she followed Victor's gaze, which had lifted slightly, no longer focused on her, no longer relaxed. Naomi straightened and stepped back immediately, her role reclaimed, her presence dissolving into the background once more as if she had never been there at all. The room continued to function as expected, glasses clinking softly, music flowing uninterrupted, conversations carrying on, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted beneath the surface. Victor's mind moved quickly, cataloging the details he had ignored moments earlier, the subtle glances, the timing, the way the room felt just slightly off. He trusted Naomi's warning not because he understood it, but because he understood instinct, and instinct rarely spoke without reason. Isabella studied him now, her expression curious, faintly unsettled by his sudden stillness. Victor offered her a small, reassuring smile, the kind he had perfected over years, calm and unassuming, but his eyes no longer mirrored it. Naomi, now several steps away, felt the echo of her choice settle into her chest, not relief, but clarity. She did not look back. She did not wait to see the outcome. She understood that her part in this moment was already complete, that whatever happened next would unfold beyond her control. Victor shifted in his chair, a controlled movement that signaled decision without spectacle, his attention sharpened, his awareness fully engaged. The confidence that had filled the room moments earlier had not vanished, but it had transformed, redirected by a warning delivered from the only person who had nothing to gain by giving it. Around them, the dining room remained unchanged, wrapped in the illusion of normalcy, unaware that the quietest voice in the room had just altered its course. Victor Romano did not rush, and that was the first thing that changed the air around the table. He lifted his glass with the same measured ease he had shown all evening, took a slow sip, and set it down carefully, as though nothing at all had disrupted his plans. To anyone watching, he appeared composed, unbothered, still fully in control of the moment. Yet beneath that calm exterior, his focus sharpened, every sense attuned to the smallest details he had dismissed minutes earlier. He noticed the timing of the service staff, the way one server paused too long near the entrance, the way conversations nearby seemed slightly forced, laughter arriving a fraction of a second too late. He did not search for confirmation, because confirmation was not what he relied on. He trusted patterns, and patterns had just shifted. Isabella watched him closely now, her expression curious, her confidence subtly unsettled by his sudden attentiveness. Victor reached across the table and rested his hand lightly over hers, a gesture gentle enough to reassure without drawing attention. He smiled and suggested they step outside for a moment, his tone casual, almost affectionate, as if proposing nothing more than a change of scenery. Isabella hesitated only briefly before agreeing, rising with him as chairs were quietly adjusted and the staff moved to accommodate them. The dining room adapted instantly, clearing a path without question, the invisible machinery of service responding to his movement as it always had. Naomi observed from a distance, her role fully reclaimed, her face neutral as she watched Victor guide Isabella away from the table. She did not know what he planned, only that he had listened, truly listened, without demanding explanation or proof. Victor paused near the edge of the room, turning just enough to catch the eye of a staff member who had worked there long enough to recognize subtle instruction. Nothing was spoken, but the message was clear: delay, redirect, maintain calm. The music continued, glasses clinked, conversations resumed their comfortable cadence, and the illusion of normalcy held strong. Isabella leaned closer to Victor as they walked, asking if everything was all right, her voice low, controlled. Victor reassured her smoothly, explaining that he wanted to check something outside, nothing urgent, nothing to worry about. His voice carried warmth, but his attention remained divided, scanning reflections in glass, movements behind them, exits that had not mattered moments ago. Naomi felt the tension she had carried begin to shift, not dissipating, but transforming into a quiet watchfulness. She understood that the outcome no longer depended on her, that whatever Victor had set in motion would unfold beyond her reach. Victor stepped through the doorway with Isabella beside him, his pace unhurried, his posture relaxed, projecting certainty to anyone who might be watching. Only once they were beyond the main room did his focus fully turn outward, his awareness expanding as the comfortable confines of the dining room fell behind them. Inside, the restaurant continued uninterrupted, guests unaware that the evening they believed they were sharing had subtly changed direction, had unfolded exactly as planned. Naomi Brooks moved through the space with steady precision, her posture composed, her expression neutral, yet something about her presence had changed. She no longer felt like a background fixture merely reacting to the flow of service, but like someone who had crossed an unseen threshold and returned altered by it. She noticed how a few staff members exchanged brief, uncertain glances toward the entrance Victor had exited through, confusion flickering across their faces before being quickly replaced by professionalism. No explanations were offered, and none were requested. The system adjusted, as it always did, absorbing disruption without acknowledging it. Naomi continued her work, her mind calm, grounded by the knowledge that the moment demanding action had passed. Outside the dining room, Victor Romano stood with Isabella beneath the muted glow of exterior lighting, his demeanor unchanged to her eyes, reassuring, attentive, entirely in control. Once, as their paths crossed briefly in the restaurant weeks later, He met her gaze for a fraction of a second longer than necessary and gave a slight nod, subtle enough to escape notice, deliberate enough to be unmistakable. Naomi returned it with the same restraint, understanding that this was all the acknowledgement either of them required. The world around them continued to operate on assumptions about power and visibility, about who mattered and who did not. But that evening had revealed something quieter and more enduring, that awareness could come from the margins, that influence did not always announce itself, and that dignity often lived in the choices made when no one was watching. And long after the details of that night faded, the truth remained, that the most dangerous voice in the room had not raised itself, and the most decisive act had come from the one person everyone had been trained not to see.